A very special thanks goes out to Professor Kitty Bateman of the English department. It is Kitty who embraced... Right. It's Kitty who embraced the idea for today's conversation and followed through with every detail for arranging and making this event possible. It's Kitty we thank for the coffee. Yes, all right. And finally, a special thank you to Professor Kathleen Wentrack, who accepted the invitation to interview Professor Milani. And our very special thanks to our invited and honored guest, Professor Lilia Melani, who through her example has provided CUNY women, faculty, and staff a historical legacy of courage. We are pleased to invite Professor Kitty Bateman to the podium now, who will introduce Professor Milani. Professor Bateman.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and welcome to a very special occasion at Queensborough Community College, the visit of Professor Lilia Melani, who was the lead plaintiff in a class action suit initiated in 1973, close to 50 years ago, but who's counting, against the Board of Higher Education, alleging sex discrimination against female faculty, HEOs, and other categories which Lilia will describe in some detail. I personally would like to take this opportunity to honor her for her groundbreaking work. Every woman in the university at the time and thereafter benefited from her trailblazing efforts. We are all in her debt, and I hope that she knows how much we appreciate the work she's done. Thank you.
Hi, so good afternoon. Thank you, Lilia, for coming to Queensborough today to discuss your role in this very historic event for women at CUNY. Thank you, everyone, for coming today to listen to our conversation. So I just want to we'll start right away of what prompted you to begin this action?
That women were being treated unfairly, which I came to really see once I became a feminist through consciousness raising. You can't hear me, can you?
I think we might just
How is this? Can you hear me now? Oh, is that working? How about now? No.
No. Try this one.
Okay, how about now? Okay. I want to thank Kitty Bateman for that lovely introduction, but I want to make one thing clear, that I was not a Joan of Arc. It was not me alone leading an army. There were many other women who were always there beside me, fighting together. It was a movement, not one heroic figure, which is how history tends to portray events and what happens. The reason I became a feminist through consciousness raising, and I had been active in the union as a grievance counselor and an officer. And I saw maltreatment of individuals throughout the university. And after I became a feminist, I saw the specific abuse of women. And that's what moved me. And I had the contacts and the knowledge to organize a fight, to start calling women together through my union activity. So that was the beginning.
Okay, so what were some of the goals as you started to organize, and
My goal, yeah.
Start with the goals, sorry.
I had one overriding goal, and that was to change the distribution of power in the university so that women had equal positions and equal power within the university. And that meant a total overturning of the existing structure. It wasn't just to get equity for individual women. Yes, that was there. But if all you did was got the women who were there now their promotions, you got their salaries equalized, the same discriminatory system would continue to operate. It all had to be changed. So that was really my goal, and everything else came out of that or supported that.
So how did you begin? How did you begin to organize the women involved?
Okay. I taught at Brooklyn College, and another woman there, Renata Breidenthal in history, had started a Brooklyn College women's organization. My story, this is going to take some time to tell you, because I want to talk about synchronicity. Women were moving, events were moving in the same direction, and we came together because of that. In a different time, I could have done the same things and not gotten the results that occurred. She had organized women at Brooklyn College, an organization to fight for women's rights. And that included students and student daycare. It wasn't just for faculty. And also the administrative titles, HEOs. And at that time, there were also titles, the Registrar Series in Administration and the Business Manager Series, which have since disappeared. And of course, the HEOs. She had been meeting with a city councilwoman, Carol Greitzer from Greenwich Village, an ardent feminist. Some of you may know of her. And Greitzer created a plan to end discrimination in Cuny, or certainly to curtail it, and invited Renata to the meeting with the chancellor. And Renata invited me. So I was really a tag-along at that meeting that other women had set up. We met with the chancellor, and Carol Greitzer said, here is my plan. A committee of women at each campus of Cuny should be elected by the women of Cuny to investigate the status of women, what's happening with women, and what needs to change at that campus. And the chancellor, Kibbe, was a very engaging, charming, politic man. And he was very pleasant, said, I'll give this matter consideration. You all know what that means. And we left. And what he did, very few administrators are going to follow except this plan. But he saw pressure, and he said, okay, I will appoint a women's committee of my own choosing. So he appointed a blue ribbon committee of women who were in the establishment and that he assumed would support the institution, would be favorable to the institution, and he wouldn't have a lot to worry about in the results that they would come up with. It turned out to be faulty thinking, but that was the idea. We, the women, were outraged. How could he do this? He's not going to do an end run against us. So I called a meeting of women in the union that I had been working with at different campuses or had contacts with at different campuses. Now, at this time, the professional staff at City University was divided into two categories, and they were represented by two different unions. What were called the professional staff, the professors, the HEOs, the registrars, the business managers, were represented by a lobbying group called the Legislative Conference. We, the full-time and part-time lecturers, who were known as the fluid bottom, because we were so dispensable, were represented by the United Federation of College Teachers. I was a lowly lecturer, the fluid bottom. Now, as it turned out, and this is where synchronicity and events moving in the same direction becomes really clear. The night that I had chosen to have a meeting of the UFCT women at what was then the Graduate Center on 42nd Street, a staff woman in the legislative conference had called a meeting of women at the same date in the same building. So we were on one floor and they were on another floor. And somebody at their meeting said, there are other women meeting. So you see the power of women in that. Is this still working? Yes. So this woman said, we should join them. So they came down, and even though we were represented by two different unions, we were two different bargaining groups, we became one group. And we formed an organization called the Cuny Women's Coalition. And it also turned out that at that meeting, the other meeting, a now discrimination counselor by the name of Dee Albert had also been invited. And she informed the group that Title VII was going to be changing. This was a meeting in December, that May, Title VII was changing so that it would apply, discrimination would become illegal against women in universities. Wasn't until then. And so all these groups, this group of about 100 women, came together. It was not planned, it was serendipitous, and it was very powerful. So that night, we formed an organization, we elected officers, and we started planning for the class action suit because we knew that in May, in a few months, it would become illegal to discriminate against women, and we were going to be ready. We would have our charges, our forms, all made out. And so that spring, we gathered women together who wrote out the case against them, how they had been discriminated against. And at that time, the regulation was that the individual woman aggrieved did not have to sign. Somebody else could make the charge for her. That was to encourage women who were afraid of being retaliated against. Well, that rule changed very quickly for a variety of reasons. So we had about 100 forms, 100 women had come forward, and Dee had signed for all of them. She was the charging person. We had to redo those 100 charges as forms. However, you know exactly what happened. Many women dropped out. They were afraid. And because I was in the union, had been active in the union, and we needed an attorney, I went to Judy Vladeck. The firm of Vladeck and Vladeck, very noted labor attorneys, represented us, the UFCT. And I asked her to represent us in court. And she said, "Are you sure you want me? Wouldn't you like a young feminist attorney?" And I said, "No, we want you," which we did. She was a great attorney, and she knew the system. She knew everything about Cuny. And there was a second question. And she asked me, "Do you know what's involved?" And I said, "Absolutely." And the truth was, I did not have a clue to what was involved. But what I did know is that no matter what we had to do, we were going to do it. We were committed. Okay, so
It's wonderful hearing this history, you know, especially for those of us who weren't involved and didn't know about it at the time. And
so it was all of us together, all of these events and people coming together with the same commitment.
so what So it's fantastic, the synchronicity that you're describing of having similar concerns and ideas and trying to find a way to make it work, and then coming together and forming the CWC. So what were some of the first things that you did to go forward with the lawsuit and organizing other women?
Okay. We established a newsletter to inform the whole bargaining unit. Well, there two things were going on, two strands. One was what Judy Vladeck was doing in the courts, that only she, as a lawyer, could do. And the other thing was what we could do, which is to gather information for the charges, to gather grievance, individual women who would be willing to come forward, and to inform the women in Cuny. There were about 5,000 at that point. We had a newsletter, and how we could afford the newsletter, because in the beginning we were very idealistic. We came out of the radical wing. The organizers of the Cuny Women's Coalition came out of the radical wing of the women's movement. We didn't believe in structure. We didn't charge dues. So that made paying the expenses of the lawsuit and the newsletter difficult. And we had, as chance would have it, a woman dean at Queensborough who ran off the newsletter for us at Queensborough's expense. It's a long time ago, so I'm sure any statute of limitation of illegal activity has expired. And I would drive out, I live in Manhattan, and I would drive out once a month, pick up these cartons of newsletters. There were like 3 or 4 giant cartons, because you're talking about 5,000 newsletters. And then we had a delegate for each branch of Cuny. There were 18 or 19 of them at that point. And I would go back to drive back. Well, some I dropped off in Queens. I would have to count them, break them into the correct number, drive to that person's house, give them the newsletter, and then go on to the next people. Fortunately, even though we were scattered among the 5 boroughs, the colleges, most of the women, the delegates, lived in Manhattan. So I didn't have to drive out to Staten Island and the Bronx. And then there was fundraising. And probably that was the hardest part. Frankly, the faculty of Cuny is cheap. Their pocketbooks were closed. So we got very little. We finally did charge dues, $5. But no, I think $10 for full-time faculty for the year and $5 for part-time. So you know that we were never flush. And the lawsuit continued on with Judy Vladeck. So those were the things, the major things.
So to go forward with the lawsuit, how did you gather information, and what kind of information did you have to gather to support your cause, our cause?
Okay. Legally, a lawsuit, a class action suit, now the law is constantly changing. It doesn't remain the same. At the time that we filed in December 1973, we went into federal court, which I always regarded as our Christmas present to the chancellor. The first phase was getting certified as a class. We had to prove to the court, and we had a wonderful court, a wonderful judge, Judge Gagliardi, who was very sympathetic to working people. Not all are. We had to prove that the women that we were claiming in Cuny had been discriminated against were a cohesive class, that they met the legal definition of what a class was in order for this to be a class action suit. And that was the first battle. We won that. And what was very useful to us was the fact that we had a union contract, so that we were obviously cohesive groups or cohesive classes. The next thing was gathering data. Now, we had gathered data informally by going through catalogs, by word of mouth, by looking at lists and departments, seeing who was male, who was female, what was their rank, were they full professors, associate professors, instructors, lecturers, full-time, part-time. We were aided by the fact that Cuny has something called chancellor's reports, in which every action has to be recorded. So salaries were in there. So we had to find people to go through all these things. So we collected what would be informal data to support our claims. That would not be enough, that would not be strong enough to go into court with, so that we entered another phase called discovery, where the judge ordered that women could go into every office of Cuny and every department and look at every 7th personnel file, which would make it a random survey. We had hired a statistician, Mark Killingsworth from Princeton, a young man at the beginning of his career. And he created a form. And we had, at this point, a small army of women volunteers who went into Cuny, because we were looking at the files of women, men and women, currently hired, men and women who had been in the system since 1972 and were no longer there. So we looked at old personnel files, and we also looked at the files of men and women who applied for positions in Cuny. So it was, you're talking about tens of thousands of personnel files. So this little army of women went in, filled out their forms, and gave them to the statistician. And our statistician ran a summary of all this data using all sorts of complicated statistics, and found that women were discriminated against everywhere, in every way. Meanwhile, the university had its statistician, a man at the peak of his career, a distinguished professor by the name of Borgata, who, I'm not a sociologist, but he was very well known as a sociologist. He had created something called the Borgata Scale. I have no idea what it is, but he was famous for it. Any sociologists here?
I've heard of it.
You've heard of it? Okay. Maybe somebody else can explain it someday, but he developed his own system for showing discrimination in Cuny, or not showing it. And it was a perfect approach for showing that there was no discrimination. What he did is he took males and females who had comparable credentials at each rank and compared them. And his analysis showed that they were pretty much the same. There wasn't much difference. Maybe it took women a little longer, but not statistically very significant. But of course, what this system, this approach did is it ignored the fact that at the bottom rank, you had the majority of women and fewer men. And at the top rank, the full professorship, you had very few women and a lot of men. So how do you pair them? What you do is you drop all those excess men at the top, and you drop all those excess women at the bottom, and you don't find much discrimination. The judge got it. Okay, so, and also in collecting statistics, we had individual cases. And the university, when we presented our statistics, we also used university statistics that had been generated by every campus. And the university said that its data, the data it had collected and provided us, was faulty and couldn't be relied on to prove discrimination. So we were dealing with all this. And then the third phase was trial. And the judge said he would hear arguments on one issue. What do you think the key issue is? Money. Isn't it? Is that always, it's money? Okay, so were women and men with comparable credentials earning the same amount of money? And now at this point, okay, money. The head of the committee that the chancellor at the very beginning had appointed, his blue ribbon committee, which D. Albert said was his committee of chancellor's handmaidens, had come up with its findings. The chairwoman was a political scientist from Queens by the name of Marilyn Gattell, who was one strong woman and very well known. She had been involved in, only those of you who are older or maybe in education will remember this controversy, Brownsville, Ocean Hill, a very, very bitter fight in the New York public school system. She had been involved in that. Her committee came out with its report, and they found discrimination against women in every area and every aspect of university life. And this was his own chancellor's committee that had done that. And in the end, it worked out better that he appointed his women because they had more credential, more credibility than we would have had. They would have looked less partisan to the court and in public opinion. So again, synchronicity. Events turned out perfectly for us. Marilyn Gattell's testimony was very favorable to us in court. The judge found for the women. He said, yes, Cuny intentionally discriminated against women. Now, by intentionally, he didn't mean that anyone sat down and conspired to pay women less, but that the university had been put on notice that there was a problem with the pay scale for women and men and had done nothing about it. In that sense, it was intentional because it was allowed to continue even though they knew that there was a problem. The university at this point, having lost this, wanted to appeal this decision. Now, this was our lawsuit at the time we filed it, was the largest class action suit brought by university women. It was largest in the sense that Cuny was one of the largest, the second or third largest university system in the country, and largest in how many charges we made, how many areas we said women were discriminated against. We covered the terms and conditions of employment thoroughly. And the judge, very smart, said, no, you can't appeal one cause of action, which is what a charge is called legally. The whole case has to be heard. Well, if Cuny had discriminated in salary, that discrimination had to come from somewhere. That meant we had to win other causes of action, and they were the major causes of action. Salary and level of appointment, promotion, tenure, the big money issues. So at this point, the university settled. Okay. I answered more than you asked.
No, but that's great. No, that's great. Those were all sort of things sort of floating in the air and wanting to know about. So they settled.
Yes.
But when you went into this, so you really were unsure of whether or not you would win because SUNY was less successful.
Yes, at the same time, a year or two after us, SUNY, a sociologist very well known by the name of Koser, and other named plaintiffs sued SUNY for sex discrimination. They used the same attorney we did and the same statistician. They had a different judge. They lost. So we were very fortunate. Things came together for us. Being right does not necessarily mean that you will win your case in court.
Yeah.
I don't think that's news to anybody
Right. Right.
in this room.
So
And I'll just say one more thing.
Go ahead.
I spent many nights worrying about how we were going to pay Judith Vladeck if we lost the case. Because I knew there would be very little money forthcoming from the women.
But the university had to pay her fees.
Yes, yes, yes. Part of the settlement was she got paid, and I could sleep soundly.
Great. So, so once this settlement was established, I should say, how long did it take to adjudicate the case? What was the settlement? Some of the terms of that?
Okay, the settlement was very complicated because there were a lot of people involved, tens of thousands, women, and different categories and situations and causes of action. The major ones were, there was a one-time payment to all the women currently employed since 1972 who would receive a lump sum of money based on how long they had served. It didn't matter whether they made any claim of discrimination or not. This was an across-the-board award. So every woman, full-time woman, in the professorial titles and the administrative titles, anybody who came under the contract of the Professional Staff Congress was full-time, was entitled to a certain amount of money. That was the first thing. Then there were special procedures set up with special masters who would hear the cases of individual women. Women came forward and made claims that they were paid less than men with comparable credentials. So many women had their salaries equalized. Their salaries were increased. Women came forward and said, I was not promoted. And many women, there was a big influx of women being promoted from associate professor to full professor. Then there were individual categories. That someone had been harassed. Somebody had not been promoted, had been treated unfairly because of nepotism. A woman might come in and say that she had gotten terrible teaching schedules consistently when men weren't. One way of pushing a woman out of a department would be to give her a bad schedule, an early morning class and a late class, or somebody who had children, a schedule where she couldn't keep her commitment to the children, whereas a male would would have been accommodated. All these cases were heard by special masters. And one of the consequences of our filing the suit, I just want to throw this in, all of the positions, the chancellors, the deans at the central office, at the university level, the chancellor, the deputy chancellor, that whole administrative series, they were all male and had always been male. And as a result of our suit, they hired a woman vice chancellor in legal affairs, so that when we went to court, you would have two women facing each other rather than a woman and a man. But it didn't matter. A woman got hired, and that broke the ice. And there have been many women in these titles since.
So this is great. So there was also, as a result too of this, the Women's Research Development Leadership Fund, correct? And then also the Milani Scholarship Fund that was established at the same time, correct?
Yes. All right. Monies were allocated for the women who had been in CUNY or who had applied, a certain fund. Whatever monies were not used up by a certain time, within 3 years, there was a time limit on the settlement, that would go into a Women's Research and Development Fund. And certainly, and almost entirely, the money that was set aside to remedy the women who had applied but not hired unjustly, very little of that money was claimed. You can see the difficulties for reaching these women. They wouldn't even know that this was happening. And how do you even prove that? Because they had no idea who was hired instead. So a good deal of money was set aside. And I served with Sylvia Miranda, who's sitting here in the red scarf, on the committee, the board of directors, for that fund. We gave we gave grants to women, junior women, so that they could do their research and get promoted or get tenure. We gave money to women so that they could go back to school and complete their degrees, so they could get their PhDs. And then, now these were for the teaching faculty. Then there was a whole group of women administrators. By this time, I think they were almost entirely in the HEO titles. Not entirely, but almost entirely. The others had been phased out. And we created a women's research and development. We gave an institute, a leadership institute. Sylvia, do you want to say anything about that?
It was held at the Boy Scouts camp for a week. Women served, were recruiting experts how to become a leader on the university level.
I went to that.
Kitty went to that.
And one of the things that I was most impressed by, years later, so many of those people were able to achieve high standing in terms of the administrative posting. And at least 7 of that initial group became college presidents.
Wow.
So that we really break the ice for lots of women, not just in the classrooms.
Okay. Now, the CUNY Women's Coalition over the years we had collected money, and there were always women who would give give a fair amount. So we'd expended about $15,000 or $20,000 over the 12 years that this class action suit dragged on. So the university, in the settlement, paid us back our money, and much to my relief, they paid Judy Vladeck and her firm their money. And I would say that in Judy Vladeck's firm, there was some grumbling at how much money the suit was costing the firm, even though they might not get it back, but they did. With the money we got back, which was about $15,000, one of the things that we established was the CUNY Women's Coalition Scholarship Fund. for students who were achieving but were having financial difficulties. And that fund went on for about 10 years until we exhausted it, because we did fundraising for it. And wonderful, wonderful women, students that were helped by that fund.
It's really, yeah, really wonderful. And it took a long time for this all to settle out. It wasn't until 1984, right, that this all came around. So
That time I was innocent.
Yeah.
It wasn't me.
So, you know, almost 50 years later, what do you think are the implications for us CUNY women now?
That you have to fight for your rights, even if it looks hopeless. But they have to be well chosen. In other words, you can't fight everything. You lose credibility and you destroy yourself. One of the things that's very present to me, I know this isn't the way this question is normally answered.
That's okay.
But through my union activities in representing grievance and in working with women in the CUNY Women's Coalition, because I would counsel women, give advice on their employment and problems they were having, and guidance in using the contract and the union. That when you take on a struggle, you can't become the struggle. It can't displace your identity. And I watched many people, men and women, who became their grievance. It obsessed them. They talked about it all the time. And they became slightly deranged in the eyes of others. There was no balance left anymore. No judgment. And then the university, in their cases, would say, look how unbalanced this person is. This is why we had to let this person go. Or this is why we couldn't promote this person. So that one of the consequences of being treated unfairly, this deterioration in the person, the psychic damage, became turned around and used against them as a cause, so that they were victimized in yet another way. I think about that still, even though I haven't done many cases. And I think how you fight depends on what tools you have available. Do you have a contract? Do you have a law? Do you have to use public opinion? Do you have to use political pressure? I guess that's what I would have to say.
That's a very, interesting observation and good advice as well. I was thinking it would be a good time to perhaps open it up to the floor to questions. Yes, Alex?
Yeah, I'd like to know, where was the PSC in all of this? They have their own lawyers. There's leadership in the PSC. How did they treat you, and do they support your efforts in any way?
We spoke about that, yeah.
Okay. First of all, let me see. I'm thinking of the short answer. So that first of all, I was in the union. By that, I don't mean I was merely a member. I was a grievance counselor at Brooklyn College. I was chapter chairperson at Brooklyn College, and I was an officer of the executive committee at the local, so that I was an integral part of the union administration. And the reason I chose to keep the women separate is I thought, first of all, this has to be a case by women for women. But the real reason, the underlying reason, really compelling reason, was that many of the delegates in the union and the activists in the union were the same people who at their campus were discriminating against women. And I did not want them having any say over our class action suit. So out of that came Women for Women. But it was really, I would sit next to one member, and I was fighting a grievance against him over a teaching observation he had written. I talked about this at lunch. A very attractive, sexy young woman, just beginning her career. He and an older faculty member had observed her teaching, and their teaching observation started out, I can't remember the name of the other professor, but anyway, Professor so-and-so and I have huffed and puffed and labored mightily over this young woman, and we will prevail in improving her teaching. It's a disgusting. It's not a professional teaching observation. Can you imagine a man writing a teaching observation of another man saying, we have huffed and puffed, right, over this young man and will prevail in improving his teaching? Anyway, so women were getting teaching observations like her skirt is too short, her hair, I'm quoting from actual observations, her hair is too long. Okay, so that's why now, it was not that the union was hostile as a union, as an organization, but it was that I looked at the people, some of the people around me who had position and power, and I said, no. Now, there was a time, in all fairness to the union, when we were having financial difficulties in paying our statistician, and the union gave us $5,000, lent us $5,000.
That was nice to support your efforts in that way. But I have to say, even though you mentioned the synchronicity, it really seems like you very astutely and carefully negotiated through everything that was going on in the organizations that you had been involved in and the women that you had come in contact with for this all to be
Yes,
so
I
successful.
don't mean to make it sound like we didn't have to strategize. And I also want to make clear that I had the support of 20 or 30 women, like in the leadership, who were constant activists, giving their advice. And I was often overruled when we would take a vote. And whatever the group said is what we did. And then we had delegates at every, in fact, it would be more than 20 or 30, because we had delegates and alternates at every campus in our branches. And Kitty Bateman was the delegate at Queensborough.
Thank you. There are some other questions. As it carried.
Hi, so student evaluations, right? Nationally, it's kind of been a part of the conversation about how women are discussed in student evaluations. And at Cuny, we use student evaluations a lot to, well, it's part of the whole tenure thing, our tenure packet. And I wonder how you feel about how women get treated in these evaluations, and should they really be used to determine whether women get promoted, tenured here at Cuny?
Well, let me say first, before I answer your question directly, in my experience, student evaluations are used to support what the chairman and perhaps his appointments committee or her appointments committee want. They want the person, and they're good observations, they carry a lot of weight. If they don't want the person and they're good, the observations are ignored. If they don't want the person and the observations are good, the teaching observations are ignored. I do not mean to say that every department does this, but it's what I've observed time and time again. The credentials often do not matter, it's what the chair wants. And most faculty will go along with what the chair wants. I was on a subcommittee evaluating a faculty member for tenure. And I read his record, and what was very clear to me is that he was being treated unjustly. He had wonderful observations to a certain point, and then they were all negative. He had had a falling out with the chair. The fellows, the other two people on the subcommittee with me, I was the chair, refused to see this. It was very clear, and they both said it's what the chair wants. And he was denied tenure. Okay, now to get back to your teaching observations. It's a mixed bag. Some students are very honest, some not. Some students will say if they didn't get the grade that they think they deserved, it's because the teacher was a bad teacher. But I do think teaching observations should be looked at and considered, but not one teaching observation. I think they all have to be looked at to see the pattern, because individual classes vary. You must have had that experience.
No. I'm not speaking from experience at all, actually. I get good reviews from my students. No.
No, I meant with different classes. That some.
No. Oh, yeah, but the national conversation, though, I'm not talking about us. I think our students like us for the most part. But I'm talking about the national conversation is that when students evaluate women, they tend to go for our treatment of them rather than our knowledge. While men get evaluated by students by and large based on how they know this, and they go with us, they go, oh, she was mean, or, they evaluate attitude versus our aptitude. And so I was just asking, what do you think about that? Because CUNY uses evaluations.
Yes, it does. I haven't seen. No, I believe you.
Yeah, that women are expected to be the compassionate ones, and they, yeah.
Yes, I don't know. I gave you an answer, I'm sorry, out of
I don't know, it's an
my
honest
experience. Yes, well, what I gave was an answer based on the politics that I've observed.
Right.
And I came to CUNY in 1963, long before many of you were born. So I probably also sound cynical, but there's a reason why CUNY unionized, to protect its the faculty and staff had to protect itself.
Yes.
I
Emery.
just had a comment about student evals. I'm a chairperson, so I see hundreds and hundreds of student evals. I've noticed students do sometimes make sexist comments, but I've seen it about men and women. Actually, more recently, I've seen it in regards to their comments about men. So, that's kind of interesting. I do agree with you that we really have to look at patterns. I mean, you cannot look at a group of student evals in a class and go, look at one or two. You have to look at numbers of them to kind of, come up with some kind of thoughts about teaching experiences in combination with other things. But I think your point about patterns is I would agree with that. It's not just one or two or.
If the faculty is doing its job, are doing it with integrity, the problems that you've pointed out, where they're looking at men and women differently, they should be able to see and take into consideration. But that's the if. And you do have to use judgment. Certainly, on another committee, when I was reviewing observations, I noticed that there was an enormous discrepancy with what the outside evaluators, it was a philosopher, what the outside evaluators had said and what the student evaluations had said. The outside evaluators said, this man is brilliant. He has the capacity to be one of the outstanding philosophers of his age. The students couldn't understand him. So their evaluations were, he doesn't know, some of the students said, he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's unclear. And that presents a problem with student evaluations. What do you want from your faculty member? Here is this brilliant philosopher, but many of his students don't understand him. Luckily, I was in English, so I didn't have to. But it's a complex problem if you're really going to use the student evaluations honestly. What do they mean? And what are you looking for? What are your needs? The needs of the department, the needs of the student. But thank you for asking that.
I'm just interested to know if the grants that you were talking about still exist today, or if those were just based off the class.
No, we ran out of money.
About how much money did the university pay out because of this lawsuit?
Lucky me.
Well, because I was the university dean for affirmative action, that's how I know this. About 33 million all told. And then in answer to your question, although the Milani money ran out, what happened, because it was over 10 years, what happened was that many of the programs that were initiated as a result of Lilia's efforts in that research and development fund were copied, and so the university continues to offer faculty grants to do their research. So there is a fellowship program. I think Friday they're selecting the crop for next year. But you can apply, and then there are what are known as diversity grants. So if you have an idea to do research, it's like seed money. And again, all of these ideas were really, we borrowed. And I didn't borrow them in the sense that I was part of the fund, and I learned from what we identify as problems. And as she mentioned, the leadership, there is now a university leadership program, finally, that will focus on people who are interested in taking that track to their professional development. So various ideas that Lilia and her group, because I was not part of that initial group that took on the establishment, but I did help spend the money. But many of the programs that were developed were to address the barriers that these luminary women saw as this is standing in the way of progress in terms of people achieving their professional goals. So I think we owe you a major debt.
You owe the committee, all the women on that committee. It was all of them.
One more comment.
Shorter question. Are there any such women's groups still in Cuny, and do you think there's value in still having them, although there's so many of us who are women in Cuny in those positions right now?
I know of no overriding one, individual women's groups in different campuses. And yes, I think there is a value. There is a value. The discrimination against women today is more muted. To express it openly is kind of politically incorrect, depending on the part of the country you live in. There are parts of the country where it would just be business as usual. And while the surface may be more favorable to women, underneath it may not be. So yes, and I think that many younger women are going to have to learn this by hitting their heads against the barriers that they're not seeing yet, which is what happened to the women in the 60s. Betty Friedan started opening our eyes with the feminine mystique, which I never read. I didn't realize what it was. I heard the title and I thought, that's disgusting, feminine mystique. I didn't realize she was writing against it. So it was years before I read it. But I think your generation will have to have its own feminine mystique for a meaningful movement to arise. You have to feel it yourselves, as a group.
Well, I'm a feminist art historian. There's a lot of women's groups and women-identified groups that are still out there. The Feminist Art Project, the Feminist Institute, and Women's Collective and Collaborative Galleries, AIR Gallery, which Kat Griefin, a number of years ago, was the director, Soho 20, and so many more around the country. And I still think there's a lot of strong women's groups out there and the need for it.
I agree.
Cuny, that's, I'm not really sure. I think maybe we need to do something about that. Heather, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to suggestions about promoting this dissolving of our biases in this institutional culture. I feel like some people take on this work individually, but I really sense that maybe part of this movement we are wanting to feel out together is also something that we need to ask other people to participate with us, and like what that might look like on a systems level to acknowledge that these successes have occurred, and yet there's still just so much more work to be done. And how do we promote the education of ourselves in this institution of higher learning?
You raised a lot of issues, and all valid, all valid. Okay, what can you do? And you raised the issue of it at the individual level and the institutional level. And I think the answers are different for that. On the institutional level, you have to identify where are the problem areas. Where are women being discriminated against or held back or treated differently? But it's not enough just to make your charge. You then need to gather, now this is based on my experience, and it may be that it's not applicable in your situation or some other type of employment or institution. But you have to get the statistics. You've got to, and it may not be, or you have to get the data. You have to accumulate proof. It's not enough to just say women aren't treated well. What's your proof? So there's work to be done to prove it. Then, what is it you want? What is it you want in order to make changes? You have to have specific requests or recommendations. It can't just be some general thing. Women have to be treated better. It has to be very specific because you're asking the other person to take action. And then, where are the power holders? Who are the people that could make it happen? How do you approach them? Is there a hierarchy that you need to use, to go through? Now, I just started at the point with the class action suit, which was at the end of a very long process. We did not start with a class action suit. The CUNY Women's Coalition Even we did things that we knew were futile, that we knew would produce no results, but that had to be done so that we could point to them and say, we tried everything, and we went to court. We took this final action because there was nothing else. We had meetings we wrote for meetings with every president. We wrote to every affirmative action officer. We created our own affirmative action plan that we sent to every affirmative action officer. I can't remember who else we sent it to. It's a while back. We knew this was a waste of time. Nobody was going to make any change willingly, the kind of changes that we were asking for willingly. But we could point and say, look at everything we did, and yet they did nothing. So it's a question of planning a tact. If you're planning on changing a company, an institution, you have to look at it, the politics of it, the power distribution of it. You've got to get all whatever it is you need to do. And I gave you my illustration, which might not work in your case. For yourself, in my day, I would have said, join a consciousness-raising group. That was one of the most transformative experiences of my life. But they're passé now. People don't do them. But I guess what you can do is talk with other people, reflect, and read, or listen to tapes. What's on social media that might be useful? Because I know that's where many of you get your information. It's where younger people are. I know this is vague, but okay, thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I appreciate that question because I do think there is a lot more too that we can do on the subtlety of the biases that still exist. It's much more subtle.
And I would add also, when you read about women who are taking action, who are doing something, write letters of support or emails of support, or do a hashtag. Look at what happened with the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
If you strike a chord, and you never know what that chord will be,
I know.
much can happen.
Yeah.
Is there another question? We want to thank you. First of all, we want to thank Kathleen for coming and doing the interview, especially thank Professor Milani. Can we give her a hand, please? All of you in this room to continue the conversation, right? This is just the beginning.